Welcome, everybody. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Jeremy Burton. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston. And we're glad to have you join us today for a continuing series of conversations with leaders within the network of JCRC member organizations. In December, we launched this series of conversations with the professionals who lead the organizations that make up the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston. And for those of you who are new for the first time, I'll just say that JCRC is a network of over 40 organizations that together, along with community representatives and the members of our board and the members of all of our member organizations, define the values, interests, and priorities of the organized Jewish community of Greater Boston and engage in the civic space in the work of community relations. And one of the questions we've been asking ourselves is, what does it mean when we say that we represent an organized Jewish community? We are often seen talking about specific issues of policy, specific issues that are before the legislature or being debated in civic spaces. But who are we, in fact, this community? And I think the answer is in part that we are a community of communities. So we wanted to step back and get to know the communities that are together this community. These 40 organizations represent a broad spectrum of perspectives and purpose, focusing on Jewish culture, Israel advocacy, social justice, faith-based engagement, spiritual services, protecting members of our community who are in our diversity and lifting up their voices within the community conversation. And we're lifting them up and focusing on the work of our diverse member organizations in this conversation. Today, I'm being joined by one of my colleagues, Aris Fertig, the Executive Director of one of our founding organizations all the way back in 1944, the New England Jewish Labor Committee. Ari is a friend and a colleague. He joined the Jewish Labor Committee in 2019. Before coming to the JLC, Ari was with the Conversation USA, also known as TCUSA, as a manager of university editorial relations, handling relationships with over 50 colleges and university member media teams. We'll throw his full bio and a link to the Jewish Labor Committee's website in the chat. And before I turn it over to Ari, a reminder, as always, that you can post a question for us in the Q&A. We'll have a conversation. We'll try to bring in your voices to the Q&A. And we'll actually, start this conversation, Ari, but let's focus on you personally as and I'm going to say this like a little bit laughingly because, we've become friends and had a lot of conversations over the last 3 years. I'm going to say, what is your journey into becoming a Jewish communal professional and the professional leader of one of our member organizations?
Well, thank you. And first, let me just say thank you, Jeremy, for having me here today. And thanks to the whole JCRC team. I'm really excited to have this conversation. My journey was really circuitous, but I think I always knew that I was going to be working in the field of social justice. My whole life, my whole career has been about fighting for a better democracy, fighting for better whether that's more and better candidates for office, or whether that is working for healthcare justice or economic justice. My whole life has really been about that. And that's because, to be honest, I come from a family that always valued social justice as a part of what we do. My mother's mother, my grandma, was this sort of fiery Brooklyn Jew who found herself in North Carolina in Winston-Salem because my grandfather came back from World War II and was an engineer and went down to, got a job in North Carolina. And this was pre-Civil Rights South. And, there was a sign down the road on the pool near them that said, "No Jews, no dogs, no Negroes," And so my grandmother would always tell me stories about, dropping the kids off at school, going to integrate the, pool or the library or the water fountains or whatever the issue of the day was, coming home, making dinner, picking up the kids, and that's just what you did. My dad is a rabbi. He told me stories of growing up, when I was growing up, about, bringing supplies to Jews under Soviet rule. And so, you mentioned a little bit of my bio. I started in electoral politics. I worked on a number of campaigns for state rep, state senate, Congress. I worked in the state house for a little while. And I got pretty burned out of that pretty quickly, quite frankly. And I kept on thinking about, well, why do I really care about these issues? And one of the things I heard in the state house in particular was like people, emailing, calling our office about, I can't afford my healthcare. I can't afford my healthcare. I can't afford my healthcare. So I wound up becoming an organizer for a group called Healthcare for All, working on making healthcare more affordable for folks. And it was at that time I had never done organizing before. So I joined a program, the Join for Justice Fellowship, which I'm sure many of the folks on this Zoom know about. But basically it was a way to integrate my Jewish identity with why I work as an organizer. And what I found was that I kind of came to join for the organizing training, but really got out of it that being Jewish is a part of why I fight for social justice. And as I was at Healthcare for All, this was at a time when we had passed health reform in Massachusetts. The Affordable Care Act was there to stay, we thought, and we were right, but it was still up in the air. And we were now working on the next phase of health reform, which is this incredibly wonky, terribly boring title of payment and delivery system reform, which is just a fancy way of saying paying our doctors and hospitals a different way to reward better quality of care. And I found that nobody understood what the heck we were talking about. And so I got more interested in communications and helping people break down, complex policy and things like that. And so I did a little bit of communications for Healthcare for All. And then this opportunity came up at The Conversation, which is, as you said, it's a news site that gets academics to write news articles, and then it's edited by journalists, and then it's free to read and free to republish for the whole public. And so I loved being in journalism. It was a really great thing. But then Charlottesville happened. And at the Unite the Right rally, they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And then later in 2018, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting happened. And I became increasingly worried about rising right-wing white supremacy and anti-Semitism. And I wanted to get back into activism and organizing and making a difference much more directly than journalism would allow. And I wanted to do it from a particularly Jewish perspective. And one of the things I was thinking about, to be honest, was, why is white supremacy on the rise in America? And one of the reasons, not the only reason by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the reasons it seemed to me is that we're in a system where people's economic outlook is really, stagnant, quite frankly, where they feel really insecure. And there's a massive amount of economic disparities and wealth inequality and economic anxiety. And that really leads people to want scapegoats. And these days, those scapegoats take many forms, not just the Jewish community, of course, but white supremacy inevitably includes targeting the Jewish community. And so that led me to think about wanting to tackle economic issues and fight for economic justice, as well as fighting anti-Semitism and for the Jewish community's interest. And there's really no better place to do that than the JLC. So that's how I made my way to the JLC.
I appreciate you sharing all that. For this purpose of our audience, I'm going to do a little translation. Healthcare for All is an organization that I think some people would call we, JCRC, worked with very closely on many of the things that you just described. That obviously, we were early and proudly part of the coalition on what back in the day was called Romney Care before it became Obamacare.
That's right.
But sure. So Healthcare for All is a longtime partner of JCRC, and also I'll just say Join for Justice, used to be the Jewish Organizing Initiative. Also, somewhere many alumni of JCRC have gone on to work there, and several of our staff over the years came into JCRC as joint fellows, including one current member, offhand of our current team. And frankly, several of there've been a lot of board members going back and forth. So you've mentioned two organizations.
Yeah.
There's a really long and deep relationship and connection to JCRC. But what I want to really focus in on is specifically the Jewish Labor Committee. And you just sort of shared a bit of your journey your Jewish upbringing, why you saw working on the particular challenges of our times through a Jewish lens on a personal level. But I want to pull back out, and maybe for our audience, and I don't assume everybody knows who the Jewish Labor Committee is.
Sure.
And they'll say it this way, we have member organizations that have existed for less than 10 years. New organizations, because the American Jewish story is about, the constant creation of new ways of engagement, new ways of like how we are with each other and things we're working on. We also have member organizations that are, well, to use the word, venerable. And as I said in my introduction, the Jewish Labor Committee is one of our founding members. I mean, you've been, as an institution, a part of the American Jewish story for a very long time. So for the sake of our audience, why don't we take a few minutes and who is the Jewish Labor Committee and what is that story?
Yeah, so as you said, the JLC has been around for a really long time. It really started, my understanding of it anyways, is with the United Hebrew Trades and the garment workers coming together with, I think, Workmen's Circle at the time, now Workers' Circle, and the Yiddish newspaper Forwards to form the JLC. And it was led by Baruch Vladeck. And the purpose of it was founded in 1934 to really sound the alarm about the rise of Nazism. And the early JLC founders organized a boycott of German exports and worked to bring endangered trade unionists, specifically Jewish trade unionists, to the United States. And also really tried to get the labor movement on board with fighting the Nazis. So you had in the 1934 convention of the American Federation, Vladeck and others, basically making the case that the plight of the Jews is related to the plight of workers. There's actually a fantastic book, which I happen to have here, about the early history, Rescue, Relief, and Resistance. It's by Catherine Colomb, and it's a translation actually, but basically it's about the Jewish Labor Committee's anti-Nazi operations from 34 to 45, and it's a really fascinating read if you have a chance to read it. But anyway, over time, the JLC, after the war, worked with displaced persons in DP camps, and other worked to, get Jews settled with other Jewish institutions. In the 1950s and the 60s, JLC helped really spearhead civil rights work within the labor movement and the Jewish community. Later on, fighting Soviet anti-Semitism. And one of the great things that the JLC did, starting in about, I think it was 2000, we have our now annual tradition of labor Seders, which I can talk about a little bit more in a little bit.
Definitely come back to that.
We'll come back to that. But that started in Boston, in New York, and Chicago, and Philly. And basically, we have always been on the forefront of fighting for economic justice and fighting for the Jewish community. And that takes a lot of campaigns, and a lot of the more recent, in terms of the more recent history, what we try to do is educate, mobilize, and organize the Jewish community in support of labor rights issues and workers' issues. So that took a lot of different forms and a lot of different campaigns. But some people on this call might remember the day that the Hyatt fired 100 workers, and Rabbi Barbara Penzner and Maria Axner and the JLC organized a boycott in the Hyatt 100 that they organized and won. They worked with Matahari Women's Workers Center to spearhead the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. We worked with janitors and security workers, Verizon workers, and so many more. And the idea is really we stand up for economic justice and for labor rights when they're under attack, and we get the Jewish community on board.
There's a whole bunch of threads there that I want to explore with you. And actually, briefly, I just want to clarify something. Question: the book you held, Rescue, Relief, and Resistance. I hear you just say that it was in translation?
Yeah, it was actually written in French, if you can believe it. And so I don't speak French, but I only have the English
Nor
version.
do I.
Yeah.
So it was a book written in French about
it was an
the Jewish
academic
Labor
book.
Committee.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll send it over to you.
Oh, absolutely. It's like I'm always up for another book about American Jewish history and the history of the organizational community. So
Yeah.
never heard of that one before.
Yeah.
I've already learned something myself on this in this
There you
conversation.
go.
That's great. I want to, it's like, we can dwell on this or not dwell on this, but I think it's an important part of the story. And it's also an important part of sort of the Jewish Labor Committee, Jewish Community Relations Council context. And you were talking about specifically how in 1934 and in that period, coming together to engage labor in the fight against Nazis.
Mhm.
And there is, in fact, a new book out in the last couple of months. I don't have it right next to me to hold up, and I'm not going to step away off camera to get it. Which is about the Nazis. It's called The Nazis of Copley Plaza.
Yeah.
And it's very specifically an author. He's a professor at Boston College, writing about the history of literal Nazis in Boston in the late 30s and early 40s. And there's significant reference to Jewish Community Relations Council. And we know this story amongst ourselves, and it's starting to be seen more explicitly in the academic space there, of how Jewish organizations in Boston who were deeply concerned about actual Nazis, who had offices in Copley Plaza Hotel and then on Beacon Hill, who were working with the German consulate in Boston, who were working with, frankly, Catholic priests who were on the radio, and were under investigation, being followed by the FBI. And it was the work amongst a bunch of Jewish organizations that led specifically to, like, we need to create JCRC. These organizations need to come together because we have a problem with Nazis and anti-Semitism in Boston, and we have a problem with our relationship with the media, with the faith community, i.e. the Catholic Church, and with law enforcement, that we need to come together on. And like the fact that part of Jewish Labor Committee's founding, like one of the things it was working on was very specifically this issue, and the fact that JLC, along with others, created JCRC to expand the effectiveness and network of the Jewish community to work on this, is, I think, a very sort of shared DNA, an important part of the DNA of both our organizations and our shared story together. And I say all that also, we had a council meeting last night. Ari was there, and we were just talking about the story that broke yesterday about an actual Nazi from Quincy, Massachusetts, being identified as the perpetrator of the arsons targeting several Jewish institutions here in Greater Boston in 2019. And like, it's striking to me that, some 75, 80 years later, I don't want to say they're exactly the same, but some of those same challenges continue to be on our radar collectively as a community.
Yeah. Well, we've got to learn from our history, and we have to be vigilant. And I think one of the things about that is that you're right, it's not exactly the same. Like, this is not 1930s. But I think it is important to recognize that that there is a rising wave of anti-Semitism, along with other forms of hate, anti-Asian hate, anti-Black hate, anti-immigrant, and so on. That we need to be on guard about, and we need to be actively working to fight.
So you mentioned the Labor Seder, and it's one of my personal favorite events every year. Obviously the last 2 years, unfortunately, it has not been in person, but you had a very, very effective and engaging online Seder last year, one of my favorite events last spring. And I'm certainly looking forward to what you guys do this year. But before we talk specifically about the Labor Seder, and you've touched on this, you've talked about the other communities that you work with, immigrant communities, you've mentioned a number of campaigns. We're here today to talk about ideas of community. And, what is the Jewish Labor Committee's idea of its community? And one of the things I think has been interesting, this has been a series, and we've already had a couple of these conversations with some of our other members. One of the things I've always thought was very interesting about the Jewish Labor Committee is the way that you talk about yourself as a Jew, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, I think I'm not, but like as a Jewish voice in the labor community and as a labor voice in the Jewish community.
That's right.
And that, to me, is like really interesting articulation as I look across all members of a member of ours who really explicitly articulates itself as being in two communities and being a bridge between those two communities.
Yeah.
And I know that informs the Seder, but I want to like ask you to talk a little bit about that identity question of the Jewish labor community's idea of its community.
So I think that's exactly the right way to describe us, is that we're the voice of the Jewish community in the labor movement and vice versa. You know, one thing about that is I don't want to give this impression on the one hand that there's Jews over here and there's workers over here, right? Because frankly, unless you're extremely wealthy or extremely poor, we're all workers. You know, as an aside, I feel like one of the greatest scams ever is making people who work in offices feel like they're not workers and that they don't have solidarity with other workers. But that's an aside. In terms of community, I really think that, you know, in the Jewish tradition, there's this notion of communal responsibility for one another, right? Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, right? It implies an obligation on all Jews to ensure that other Jews have their basic needs for food, clothing, shelter taken care of. Simply by virtue of being a Jew, one is responsible for the well-being of other Jews, right? And in the labor movement, we often talk of solidarity. You know, what does that mean, really? It means that workers in a particular union act together to promote their common interest in their workplace. It also means that, you know, they have a stake in one another, and that unions in different workplaces and different industries cooperate. You know, that's why we saw unions coming together to support, for example, the St. Vincent's nurses who are on strike. It was the longest strike in Massachusetts history, I believe, 9 or 10 months long. And you saw people in unions from across Massachusetts coming to support it, but also across the country, really. And that's what solidarity is all about. And so the Jewish labor committee, in my mind, is really about having these two communities and merging these two streams of thought about solidarity and Kol Yisrael, which are really quite similar, in fact. And that the Jewish people ought to be in solidarity with workers because we are workers, but not just because of that, and fight for economic justice. And the labor community ought to be in solidarity with the Jewish people because it is not just in their interest, but it's the right thing to do as well. And so what we try to do is foster community. So there's the Labor Seder, which again, we'll come back to, but you know, it's us showing up at strikes or pickets or other campaigns. It's labor unions coming together to support the Jewish community. I know there's labor unions who, you know, work to make sure that the Holocaust Memorial, when it was desecrated, was repaired, and that there was, you know, the glass repaired and all that. And there's workers that are in coalition with Jews, and really it's about being connected with one another. And so that's sort of what I want to talk about. I don't know, there's more to get at there, but that's sort of how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, well, and yes, I remember very fondly, and you know, how the building trade union, particularly the glaziers,
Yep.
You know, when the Holocaust Memorial was desecrated twice in the summer of 2017, the summer of Charlottesville.
Yeah.
And the first time was the same week as Charlottesville, in fact. You know, they were the first ones, and they had been involved as trade unions in the construction of the memorial, you know, back in the 90s. And they picked up the phone and they were like, we want to be a part of the repair. We want to, you know, do the work, make a contribution. We're here. Actually, by the way, for folks who haven't seen it, I should say the movie City Hall, which is like a day in the life of Boston City Hall. And I warn you, it's a 4-hour movie. It's a documentary. It was, you know, was actually, there's a scene of Mayor Walsh pouring rain, and it's like myself and the Glaziers, because when the Glaziers made a donation to the rebuilding of the memorial, or to the repair of the memorial, Marty, a former leader of the of the council, labor council, sort of, you know, came over to like host a press event to show the partnership between Jews and labor. And I know it was a past president of the Jewish Labor Committee who had sort of been the first one on the phone, who was also a past president of JCRC, Don Siegel, who was the first one on the phone to pick up the phone, and said, we can bring everybody together and show these two communities, labor and the Jewish community, working together, repairing the memorial. And then there's this scene in pouring rain of Marty Walsh standing at the memorial hosting this press conference. So that's a fond memory for me.
Yeah.
Like,
by the way, Don Siegel is a legend. So
Don Siegel is a legend. Absolutely. I want to spend one more moment. Maybe let's talk about the Seder.
Yeah.
Because you use two different terms there, and you Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lezeh, all Jews are responsible for one another. And I will be a little Talmudic and note that that's like Jews being responsible for other Jews.
Yep.
And you also talked about solidarity, and those are solidarity, I'm with you, you're with me, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then and again, you define yourself and you articulate it as being part of both communities.
Yes.
And then you have this Seder, this amazing thing where labor comes together.
Yeah.
In a Seder. So why don't we talk about that event and what's going on there and what that means to be a Jewish labor community? Yeah.
So the Labor Seder is really, as you said, it's this unique, it's interfaith. It's, there's a lot of folks in the labor community who come to it that are not Jews. It's really where Jewish community leaders and labor leaders and others come to build bridges. And what we do is we connect the Passover story with the struggles for workplace justice today, right? So the idea being that the Israelites in the story of Exodus are, exploited workers. And we connect the idea of them rising up to face Pharaoh with rising up to fight for justice and better working conditions and better wages and so on today. And I think it really inspires people who come to the Seder to act and bring the voice of the Jewish community to bear in support of workplace equity. And it's this really special moment. So I have to admit, I've been to many, many labor Seders in person, but I started the JLC right before the pandemic. And then, the first Labor Seder was canceled, unfortunately, because it was March 18th or something. So it was right when the pandemic was happening. And that was really unfortunate.
We were all just canceling events those first weeks before we figured out how to use Zoom to do it.
Right, exactly. Well, it was right then. To transition it to Zoom would have been I don't know. Anyway, and then there was last year, and one of the things that I really loved about last year's was we had this video where there's the 15 different parts of the Seder, and then each part was represented by people in unions and other folks that we work with to do each piece of the Seder. So we had the hospitality workers, the Unite Here Local 26, doing the wine. We had the Mass Nurses Association doing the hand washing. We had the Carpenters Union doing the Hillel sandwich. We had, and on and on and on. And it was a really great way to make this connection between tradition and making something that we have been doing for generations with something that's really relevant now, where it is, current worker struggles and current fights, and recognizing the work that people do that so often is unseen, especially in the pandemic. We recognize more and more the essential workers, the grocery store workers, the nurses, whoever. But we don't treat them like they're essential. We don't give them the wages that they're due a lot of the time. We don't give them the paid sick time that they're due. We don't give them all of the things that make their lives better, the childcare, what have you. And that is really what this is about, is saying that there is something that the Passover story can uniquely teach us about perseverance, about justice, about fighting for workers and economic justice. And I don't know of any other organization or any other event that really brings these particular groups together at this time. And, one thing that's been unfortunate in the pandemic is that I think, quite frankly, one of the best parts of the Seder is just the mingling themselves. There's no other time really when the labor movement and the Jewish community are under one roof together. And so figuring out a way for us to do that has been a challenge. But that being said, I think it's an important gathering for those two groups to connect. This year's Labor Seder is March 27th, just so you have it all on your calendars. And
We'll be there.
There you go.
Virtually.
You can find information about that on our website too. And one of the things I was thinking about as you were asking me this question is this really small anecdote, but at the same time, like really kind of encapsulates it all, which was that it was told to me by my predecessor, Maria, who told me a story about an action that happened a few years ago at a rally near City Hall in Boston. And the JLC went down with their bright orange Jewish Labor Committee signs, which is, for those who know it, like you can't miss them. And Maria brought a few extra in case anybody else showed up. And one of the union members came up to her and asked her if he could hold one of the JLC signs. And so she said, sure, of course. And then she asked politely if he happened to be Jewish, and he said no. And so she asked, well, why do you want to hold a JLC sign? And he said, well, because you've been there for us, I want to be there for you. And that's really what it's about, right? Like it's about being there for one another. It's about seeing our struggles in one another. It's about making connections. It's about, an act as simple as holding a sign in solidarity with the Jewish community.
Great. There are a couple of questions coming in about current work and particular issues, and we'll get to some of that in a few minutes. And I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to talk a little bit specifically about what you're working on right now, other than obviously I know you're working on the Seder in a few weeks, and we threw a link in the chat. And I do appreciate how your annual event can be a little all-consuming in the weeks leading up to it, especially if I remember correctly, a fairly modest staff team that you have got.
You got it. It's just me.
Just you. Yeah. So we also appreciate you making the time for this conversation, right? Before the Seder.
Of course.
But I want to ask you just to, for a moment to think about how you think about the relationship of Jewish Labor Committee to the larger Jewish community. We've talked a lot about Jewish Labor Committee in the labor space, and
sure. You're
right. It's very powerful the ways in which we are visible in our showing up. And I love those orange t-shirts. And it's for me, it's I'm always mindful of we show up in spaces. And for me, it's personally, wearing the kippah in those spaces. And did a press conference a couple of weeks ago, an event with several Black ministers, freezing cold day, and took my very warm hat off so that the kippah would be very visible. So I totally get that. But let's talk about you're part of this network of over 40 organizations that you are a founding organization of. You have been, as an institution and as leaders, active, connected to a broader Jewish community. You have a personal, as you said, your own journey, how you grew up, the family you came from. How do you and how does the Jewish Labor Committee think about its place within the Jewish community and its idea of Jewish community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me that, when I think of what it means to be Jewish, a big part of that, as I talked about earlier, is this notion of, fighting for justice and ethics and equality and all that. And I think there is a sense, and perhaps I'm speaking out of turn, I hope I'm not, but there is a sense that some in the Jewish community have a little bit moved away from economic justice as a part of their social justice and tikkun olam and things like that. And I personally think that if economic justice is a core plank of social justice, and social justice is critical to being Jewish, then Jews have to get involved with the fight for economic justice. But I think the JLC, to your question, is there to remind the Jewish community about where we came from. That, in America, when we arrived as immigrants, we were workers, and we still are workers. And, we are there to be a voice for those type of issues. And we see ourselves as a part of the whole, that, just as there are any number of other types of groups within the Jewish community, there's Kesha, the LGBTQ group, and this one and that one. There's all sorts of different groups. Workers and economic justice, people who care about that is a core part of being part of the Jewish experience. And so that's sort of how I think about it, is that, we're one piece. If the whole entirety of the Jewish community was the JLC, it would be absurd. No, that doesn't make any sense. We're one piece of the whole, and we're a critical one.
Thanks. I appreciate that answer. I want to ponder that a little bit, frankly, before I come back to it.
Sure.
But I want to talk about, there's questions coming up, and one of them is about some current issues. And you've referenced this several different ways, like we're all workers. You have referenced a critique of, say, the modern office worker is also a worker. Yeah. It's fair to say that over the last 2 years in the pandemic, there has been a lot of conversation about what is work and where is work.
Yeah.
And let's put it on the table. Here in Massachusetts, we are expecting, maybe, I think, is it confirmed that there is going to be a referendum on the ballot this year that connects to the whole issue of the gig economy, yep. And in particular, the drivers who work in the gig economy for these various companies like Uber, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so I guess there are some questions, multiple questions about this in the chat, and you referenced this in many ways. How is JLC thinking about the particulars of the shift in terms of what is work? Yeah. A new generation, let's be blunt, your generation that is much more, has a different relationship to the 9-to-5 job or the factory job.
Yeah, right.
And to this question that's going to be on the ballot this year around gig economy workers, and how do you think of that as a Jewish concern?
Yeah. So I think what you're talking about with the coalition is that there's this, just for background for folks who don't know, Uber and Lyft and other tech companies are putting forward, and they're spending, I think they put into this campaign already something like $14 million into this campaign from outside Massachusetts money, to basically undermined rights and benefits of workers and consumers here in Massachusetts. And what they're basically trying to do is keep rideshare workers, independent contractors, with no real benefits, with no real protections, with no healthcare benefits, and yet a lot of these workers, they aren't just doing it on the side where it's oh, okay, I'll just give 10 or 15 rides or something like that, and then I have my normal day job or something like that. No, they're full-time workers. They're working. That's how they're making a living. That's how they're making their wage. And so this campaign is to oppose that ballot initiative and really say that Massachusetts isn't for sale, and to protect workers' rights. So that's really what that campaign is about, and that's something that the JLC is going to be working on. I think you're right. The whole notion of work has totally shifted, and that we're in this moment where everybody is really rethinking what it means to be a worker. The other big campaign that we're working on right now is the One Fair Wage campaign, which is, if folks don't know, Massachusetts actually has 2 minimum wages, right? So there's the minimum wage that people think of for most jobs, and then there's a lower sub-minimum wage for people like restaurant workers and tipped workers. And that is something that is really problematic for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that in pandemic times, you have people who rely on tips, relying on the customers and how they think they do, to enforce COVID restrictions and mask rules and all that. You have issues of rampant sexual harassment where I've heard from restaurant workers who say that their customer will say, "Oh, take down your mask so I can see how much to tip you, so I can judge how cute you are," or whatever, right? And by the way, the tipped wage, just as a historic point, as long as we're talking history, is a legacy of coming out of slavery. Basically, what happened was the railroad industry and the restaurant industry wanted to find a way to make Black workers who were now emancipated basically pay them much less than their white counterparts. And so they instituted a system of tipping. That's why, for the rail cars in the 19th century, but for restaurants even today, we do tip, because restaurant workers tend to be predominantly people of color, predominantly women, and it was a way to pay that group a whole lot less, because they knew that they wouldn't be able to make the same wages in tips than if they gave them a normal salary. And so it was really a legacy of slavery. It took this whole idea of noblesse oblige or whatever, and like the occasional tip that was existing in Europe at the time, and then just turned it into, no, all your wages come from tips. And it wasn't until, I want to say, the 1960s that we even got a minimum wage, and it was like federally like $2.13 or something crazy low. So the issue of tip minimum wage is a really big one that we're working on. And then the other big campaign that we're working on is the Fair Share Amendment, which is making sure that millionaires pay their fair share in taxes, so that way we can have investments in the things that we need, like education and transportation and so much, which is a real economic inequality measure that, I mentioned economic inequality a lot. So I think that's something that's really, really critical. So on all of these issues, we're working at the JLC, in addition to if there's a strike, doing strike support to, show up in solidarity, and so on. So we really, I think, punch above our weight, given how small we are as an organization.
You certainly keep busy.
Yeah.
And there's a question in the chat, which I'm gonna bring into the conversation, but I also feel it lends itself to us talking about some of the places where you punch above your weight. It brings an opportunity to talk a little about history and where we've collaborated together. And the specific question is about, and I'm reading from here, is what if any connection is there between the Jewish Labor Committee and Israel, and especially in view of the strong role of labor rights throughout Israel's history?
Yeah.
So I guess that's a setup for many ways to go that you and I can certainly talk about the Jewish Labor Committee, Israel, the labor movement in Israel, and the labor movement in America.
Would you want to talk about the?
Why don't you start?
Well, I'll start and then you can pick up. But we're laughing because JCRC and the JLC organized a trip to Israel of labor leaders back in 2019, and it was
like your first week on the job.
It was like my first week on the job. I started like June 1, and then like July, whatever it was, I was off to Israel with a bunch of folks I didn't know, and it was great. It was like it was really a life-changing trip. It was really a phenomenal thing. And that trip was about exactly what the person who asked the question was getting at, which is, what is it like for Israeli workers and Arab Israeli workers and Palestinians and so on to work, and what are the big economic issues there? And we didn't just learn, we learned a lot about the history of Israel, the history of the various conflicts and all that, but also made connections with workers in Haifa and Jerusalem and Nazareth and all over the place. And it was a really incredible trip. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about that trip, because I think for me, I think one of the things that gets lost so often when we talk about Israel in America specifically is that we only talk about, the various conflicts there, and don't talk about, Israelis and Palestinians as real people with jobs and with, issues of work and issues of equity and issues of, workplace wages and working conditions and all the rest. And I think that if we could see the issues that Israeli workers are facing, it would be a totally different conversation for Americans to have, to realize that it's not just some abstract conflict out there, you know?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think you said it very well. And like, I'll expand, like for us at JCRC, it was a bit of an experiment. We have been running trips about twice a year for the last decade, a little longer now, for civic leaders in Boston to go with us to Israel. And this was the first time in that decade that we reached out to one of our member organizations. And I should say, not so much we reached out, Don Siegel, mentioned before, reached out to me and was like, I have an idea for a partnership. And it was like, you should reach out to the Jewish Labor Committee and have this conversation. And so essentially we came together and we're like, let's do one as a partnership to experiment with how do we engage leaders in Boston who are frankly more in relationship with one of our member organizations than they are with us.
Right.
And so like Jewish Labor Committee did the recruitment and JCRC sort of did the operational side of the trip, and because we have a ground partner, we have experience with like on the ground stuff. But I will say for myself, and that's like, I don't want to like belittle it. I learned a lot on that trip, and I go to Israel and I go to the Palestinian areas a lot. Well, before the last 20 months.
Yeah.
Right. And it was fascinating to me, and it goes directly to your point. Like, I have not been to the Histadrut, the Israeli labor union. I have not been to the Histadrut headquarters in Haifa ever, and I have not been to the Histadrut headquarters in Tel Aviv, their national headquarters, probably in 20 plus years. And when we started planning this trip, I reached out to a friend who had been working in the government, had recently left the government, was working at the Histadrut. And I was like, hey, can you like hook us up with people? Can you like, like, how do we do this? And he was like, oh, this person, that person, the other person. And that was great. But what I didn't expect, and I learned a lot on that trip, for example, about the specific labor and workforce issues in the national conversation there. They get lost sometimes in our awareness of it because we're all focused on the sort of, as you say, the conflict related issues. And I didn't know, and I own this, I did not know about like collaboration that was going on between the Histadrut and Palestinian labor union movement in the Palestinian Authority areas. And it was fascinating to learn about this kind of like worker solidarity going on between Israelis and Palestinians that we never talk about in the American Jewish conversation.
Right. And that's exactly it. That, this kind of comes full circle, is solidarity is such an important piece of the culture of the labor movement that I think it can cut across lines that are traditionally divisive. And recognizing that we have things in common with one another, and that there is solidarity to be found in our fellow workers. I mean, even in the American experience, right? That's how a lot of economic division was done. I mean, there's this great book, I don't have it with me, by Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us, which is all about, do you know this book? Yeah, it's basically all about why can't we have nice things in America? A lot of the time it's because when there are social and economic programs that are pushed, people see it wrongly as just benefiting people of color. And, they use divisions between people of color and white folk to basically shoot down economic justice programs and policies. And that doesn't just hurt the people of color, that hurts all of us. And that hurts white folk too. So, I think that this notion of if we can see ourselves in one another, and if we can have worker solidarity, it can be, again, not the only vector, but one vector by which we can build relationships and make peace.
Listen, we're moving to the end of our hour. I'll just say, that was a great experience. It was a great trip. It was a fun group. I would happily, as we start to get back to the ability to travel again as a group, I would love to do another collaboration on a trip like that with the Jewish Labor Committee. I'd also love to do a collaboration maybe about doing something that looks at domestic labor and have Jewish leaders maybe travel somewhere else in this country to do that.
Phenomenal.
And look, I would love to do that trip, and I love that trip not only because totally selfish shill here, because that was where I got to spend 10 days getting to know somebody who is now our new director of government affairs, Faye Ruth Fisher, who was on that trip as a leader at SEIU 1199. And 10 days together on a bus, you get to know people and respect them in a way you did not previously really know them. And so, like, we at JCRC have definitely benefited from that experience in a very explicit way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say, I don't know if Faye Ruth is on or not, but she is a force, and you really lucked out by getting her. So
actually, yeah, we're thrilled. So I want to, we're at the end of our hour almost, so I just want to ask you, what is keeping you up at night? What are the challenges you're facing now? And what do you, whether it's you, Ari, you, a Jewish leader, you, a professional leading a Jewish organization, or just, whatever, however you want to answer that, what do you need from the Jewish community these days?
It's a great question. I think I am worried about our capacity. As we've talked about, we're a really small organization and we need help. So if there's anybody listening that wants to get involved with the JLC, please reach out to me. My contact information is on our website. We need more people in these fights, whether it's fair share, one fair wage, the No Prop 22, Massachusetts, the tech workers. We need people to get involved. And I think we also need better education in the Jewish community of a lot of these economic issues. I think if there are ways that JCRC and the JLC could work to go into Jewish communities, because obviously there's many Jewish communities, but go into Jewish communities and explain and educate about a lot of these labor issues, I think that would be a really good thing. And what keeps me up at night is that there's so much more to do. There's always more to do.
Oh, my friend, I hear you. Oh, I hear you. Listen, Ari, thank you. Thank you so much it's been great to sit down with you and have this conversation.
Yeah.
You're our friend, you are a colleague. I really just enjoy every chance we get to work together. For our audience, I'll say, like, we were just talking as we came in, that, we're not going to get into the particulars now. Just yesterday, we were working together on a totally other sort of issue where, again, JLC and Ari were providing that bridge and that connection for us to be in dialogue with one of the many labor unions that are an important part of the fabric of this community and the civic life in Massachusetts. So it's just always great to sit down with you, and I'm looking forward to our next cold tea, maybe even indoors this summer. That would be an innovation for us. So thank you for sharing your critical work with us today. And to learn more about the Jewish Labor Committee, we've included the link to your website in our chat. And to learn more about the story of JCRC on our website, we'll include a link to our website in the chat as well. And for our audience, I want to invite you to join us for the next in our series of speaker conversations this coming Tuesday, very soon, sort of on short notice, but we're very excited that on February 22nd at noon, I will be sitting down with author and comedian David Badiel for a conversation about his new book, Jews Don't Count. And we'll be discussing anti-Semitism, our political climate, and so much more. And I should flag that this conversation next Tuesday is not being recorded and therefore won't be available to watch later. So if you're interested, register, join, don't wait for the follow-up email. We'll include a link in the chat. And we have a lot of other exciting speaker series programs coming up, including continuing this conversation with the professionals who lead the communities that are the member organizations of JCRC. So thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you so much.